Caleb Rivera sat alone on the bench, his gaze fixed on the expansive garden before him. His once jet-black hair was now streaked with silver, and his face, though handsome, bore the signs of a man who had spent much of his life under the sun. To the casual observer, he might have appeared like any other man enjoying a peaceful spring afternoon. But for those who knew Caleb, it was clear something was terribly wrong. His usual warm, gentle smile had vanished, replaced by a somber expression. His deep brown eyes, once full of intelligence and humor, had grown dull, reflecting the shattered remnants of his life. He was a man broken, staring hopelessly at the blooming rose bushes and vibrant spring flowers, unable to take solace in their beauty. Though the April sun bathed him in its light, Caleb couldn't shake the cold that gripped him. Its warmth touched only his skin, failing to reach the chill that had settled deep within his soul. He shivered despite the bright day, the warmth of nature unable to offer any real comfort. His hand tightened instinctively around the small gift he held. It was a bonsai tree, her favorite. It represented a milestone in their marriage, a shared memory, and now, a symbol of what was lost. A surge of emotion welled up in him as he stared at it. Cuckold. The word echoed in his mind, bitter and incredulous. He never imagined he'd be that man. Caleb's attention shifted to the couple walking nearby, arm in arm. Even in her early 50s, Isabel still held a beauty that could turn heads. Her long black hair, streaked with silver, fell gracefully around her shoulders. Her figure was one that still drew admiration, but it was her face, her deep brown eyes and wide, radiant smile that cut Caleb the deepest. Those same eyes and that smile had once filled him with purpose, inspiring him to conquer the world. Now, they only served as reminders of his heartache. And then there was him, Billy, the man who had taken Caleb's place. Young, probably 20 years younger than Isabel, with a tall and slender frame that seemed out of place next to her. He had an odd, almost awkward look about him. "Oh, Billy," Isabel gushed, her voice soft and adoring. "I can't wait for our date on Saturday. Do you have something special planned?" Billy blinked, clearly caught off guard, but quickly covered his confusion with a sly grin. "Yes. Something special," he said, smirking as he let his hand slide down her back, boldly squeezing her rear. His intentions were unmistakable. Isabel squealed in delight, playfully swatting his arm. "Billy Collins, behave yourself," she giggled, before leaning in to plant a passionate kiss on his lips. "That should hold you until Saturday," she said, beaming up at him. Then she nestled her head against his chest, sighing contentedly as they embraced. Caleb watched in silence, struggling to make sense of the scene. His wife of 32 years, acting like a lovesick teenager with another man. It was almost too surreal. The emotions inside him churned violently, a storm of anger, sadness, and disbelief. He couldn't imagine sharing her. The thought had always been abhorrent to him, against everything he believed. Yet, here he was, no longer sharing her by choice, but by circumstance. It felt like a bad dream, a nightmare he couldn't escape. He had lost her, and deep down, he knew she wasn't coming back. The slow, agonizing death of their marriage had consumed him, leaving behind a deep, unrelenting coldness in his soul. 8 long years had passed since he first learned of her betrayal, and in the last year and a half, it had become his painful reality. His mind understood how they had gotten here, but his heart refused to accept it, amplifying his torment with every passing moment. In an effort to stave off the despair creeping in, Caleb forced himself to think of happier times. A soft smile tugged at his lips as he recalled the first time he'd met Isabel Flores. She had been with her family, spending their summer in the south of Spain. At 20 years old, Caleb had been supervising the construction of her family's villa. From the moment she spoke, she had captivated him. Even after the work was done, he found excuses to linger near the 18-year-old beauty. Most people assumed it was just a summer fling, but Isabel's parents had seen the truth long before the young couple did. They could see the depth of their daughter's feelings and knew that Caleb was equally smitten. Despite their reservations about the couple's youth, Isabel's parents recognized the bond that was forming. When summer ended and Isabel returned to the States, Caleb was determined to follow her. He began the long, arduous process of securing a visa, fueled by the hope of reuniting with the woman who had stolen his heart. But that hope seemed like a distant memory now. Isabel's absence from Caleb's life during the visa process had only fueled her desire for him. Her passion for him grew even stronger, and soon she persuaded her father to step in and expedite the process. With the Flores family's influence, securing Caleb's visa became far quicker than he had anticipated. Before long, he was on American soil, working hard on a construction crew. 2 years later, they married, marking the beginning of a 32-year love story that friends and family once envied. As Caleb sat on that bench, lost in thought, a faint smile crossed his face, reflecting on those warm memories of their early years. But his smile faded, replaced by a sadness he couldn't shake as the memories shifted to more recent times. It had been 8 years since Isabel's diagnosis with early-onset Alzheimer's. She had only been 44 when the devastating news hit. In the years that followed, they both wrestled with the fear and uncertainty that accompanied the diagnosis. A slow, inevitable descent. Countless nights were spent in prayer, their tears shared with family and church members. Eventually, they had no choice but to confront the hard truths. Together, they made life-altering decisions, seeking advice from every possible source. Their priest, Father Bernard, their 3 adult children, close friends and relatives, doctors and legal experts. 4 years ago, they made drastic changes to their lives, ones they hadn't imagined making for at least another 10 years. Caleb handed over the reins of the family construction business to their sons, Alex and Leonardo. They had always been capable, and the business thrived under their care. Caleb left himself on the payroll to ensure their insurance would stay intact, offering financial security as they faced the future. With their lives now on a different trajectory, Caleb and Isabel focused on spending as much time together as they could. Though they weren't wealthy, they had accumulated enough to live comfortably. Caleb persuaded Isabel to indulge in their shared dream of traveling. Reluctantly, she agreed, and they embarked on a year of adventures. But the joy of travel was short-lived. Isabel began having what they called bad days. At first, it was manageable, the occasional disorientation or confusion while at home. But as these incidents became more frequent during their trips, the consequences were dire. Caleb winced at the memory of trying to comfort Isabel during a terrifying episode in Rome. It was the last straw. From that moment on, they never left Brownwood again. Their ranch became their safe haven. While it wasn't one of the grand Flores estates that dotted the area, it was a comfortable 200-acre property with a dream house they had built together. It became their refuge from the world. Caleb grimaced as he thought about the day everything changed. It had started like any other morning. They had shared breakfast, talking quietly, as they always did. Isabel had left to retrieve the mail, one of her favorite daily rituals. Walking down the lane to the mailbox was a small but cherished pleasure. The October wind was brisk that morning, hinting at an early winter. Caleb had chuckled as Isabel started out the door wearing nothing but her nightgown. "My love," he had called out playfully, "aren't you forgetting something?" She had flashed him that brilliant smile, the one that always melted his resolve. Then, with a quick trip to the bedroom, she returned wearing cowboy boots under her nightgown and sweatpants she had pulled on beneath. She'd even thrown on a thick fall coat over the entire outfit. Her eclectic fashion choices were one of the early signs of the disease's progression, something Caleb had learned to accept with a bittersweet smile. From the kitchen window, Caleb watched as Isabel strolled down the lane, her long hair and gown fluttering in the wind. It was a view he'd seen countless times, but this time, it would be different. He turned away for only a moment, just long enough to clean up an orange juice spill. When he looked up again, she was gone. Panic surged through him as he bolted outside, shouting her name. But there was no response. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. He dashed back into the house, searching every room, but it remained unnervingly silent. His heart pounded as he returned to the lane, scanning the area for any trace of her. Calling her name again and again, the sound of his own voice echoed through the empty space. Caleb's mind raced, desperate to recall every detail of the morning, hoping for any clue that might lead him to where she had disappeared. Caleb vividly remembered the fleeting image of a black pickup truck driving past that morning, though he hadn't seen it stop. The fear that Isabel might have been abducted gnawed at him, escalating his panic. Racing back to the house, he immediately called his sons and daughter, and within moments, he was driving along the county road, desperately searching for any sign of her. For hours, the family scoured the area with no success. Finally, as dread began to consume him, Caleb reached out to the county sheriff's office. Sheriff Dawson, a longtime family friend, was well aware of Isabel's condition. Without hesitation, he arrived at the ranch, bringing several deputies along to assist in the search. By late afternoon, Dawson had enlisted help from the Brownwood Police Department, and soon after, a half-dozen officers joined the search. Night had fallen by the time an off-duty officer stumbled upon Isabel. She was huddled inside an old decrepit machine shed several miles away from their home, curled up beneath discarded feed sacks. They quickly rushed her to Sacred Heart Hospital, where doctors treated her for exposure. Caleb recalled the heart-wrenching moment he saw her in the emergency room. His heart broke all over again when he saw the wild disarray of her hair, partially covering her face, and the haunted look in her eyes. But the moment she recognized him, she collapsed into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably. "My love, I'm so sorry," she cried, clinging to him desperately. "I don't know what happened. I got lost, and I panicked." "Hush, querida," he whispered, gently stroking her hair. "I've got you now. You're safe." "I couldn't find you," she sobbed. "I kept running and running until I couldn't anymore. Then I found the shed and tried to stay warm, but it was so cold." Caleb held her tightly, rocking her like a child as her tears soaked into his shirt. "It's over now," he murmured softly. "You're coming home." It had taken nearly the entire night to calm her down. As he held her, he came to the painful realization that their lives were about to change forever. In the weeks that followed, the difficult discussions began. It was clear that Isabel could no longer stay on the ranch safely, but the decision to move her wasn't easy. Caleb spent many nights holding her as she cried herself to sleep, and only after she drifted off did he allow himself to shed his own tears. How do you fight something like this? How do you protect the ones you love from an enemy you can't see? He knew it was a battle they were destined to lose. They both knew it. Alzheimer's was relentless, stealing away everything and leaving nothing but heartache in its wake. A week before Isabel was set to move into Brookhaven, she had another episode. This time, she became hysterical at the mere thought of leaving their home. Caleb held her close, their tears mingling as she begged him not to send her away. For a brief moment, he almost relented. But the following morning, Isabel woke up screaming, panicked, and furious at the sight of him. She didn't recognize her husband and was horrified to find herself in bed with a stranger. Caleb's heart shattered. The decision he'd been trying to avoid was now unavoidable. It was time. 18 months had passed since that agonizing day. In that time, Isabel's condition had deteriorated rapidly. The first few months were the hardest. Caleb had visited her 2, sometimes 3 times a day, and their children came by almost daily. The hardest moments were when she didn't understand why he had to leave when visiting hours ended. Caleb would fight back tears as she clung to him, crying and begging not to be left behind. At least she wasn't tormented by those emotions anymore, he thought bitterly. A small blessing, perhaps, that she no longer remembered them. God, he whispered to himself, I know I should be grateful, but it still hurts. Isabel's laughter suddenly broke through Caleb's heavy thoughts. It wasn't that her laugh surprised him. She had always been so full of life. It was the emptiness that followed it now. Once, her laughter had the power to brighten even his darkest days. Now, it only left him feeling numb. 10 months ago, Billy had entered their lives and brought with him a pain Caleb could never have anticipated. Each day, Caleb had tried to help Isabel remember who she was, who they were. On the good days, when she remembered him, he could reclaim his beloved wife for a few precious hours. But on the bad days, the days she didn't remember, she would drift back into Billy's arms. It was a slow, excruciating battle, one that Caleb had ultimately lost. For the past 4 months, Isabel hadn't remembered him at all. Billy's real name was Daniel Whitman, a recent transfer to the Brookhaven Mental Care Facility. Caleb had learned that Daniel had suffered severe head trauma in a car accident 3 years ago, leaving him mentally impaired. The frustrating part wasn't Daniel himself. It was the fact that he was just the latest version of Billy Collins in Isabel's mind. The original Billy had been her high school sweetheart more than 35 years ago. Now, it seemed any tall, skinny white man could assume that role in her fractured memories. Just like that son of a bitch, Stephen Black, Caleb thought bitterly. He let out a deep sigh, scolding himself internally. Stop it, he chided. They're just as sick as Isabel. He tried to push the image of the gaunt 60-something man with dementia from his mind. Usually, Isabel's interactions with her Billy were innocent enough, resembling the sweet romances of a starstruck teenager. There were kisses, giggles, and playful touches. But sometimes, things went further, like they had with Stephen. Caleb squeezed his eyes shut, desperate to keep his mind from drifting back to that memory. His stomach tightened as he fought to block it out, but he was mercifully pulled from the dark thoughts by the gentle clearing of a woman's throat nearby. "Is this seat taken?" A small smile tugged at Caleb's lips. He recognized the voice immediately. Opening his eyes, he looked up to find an attractive woman in her late 40s standing before him. She appeared much younger than her age, with long blonde hair cascading over her slender frame. "Mrs. Ackerman," he greeted her weakly, offering a faint smile. "Cassie," she corrected him with a playful grin. "Cassandra," Caleb teased back, a wider smile forming. Her eyes sparkled with affection as she returned his grin. "Caleb, we've had this conversation before," she said, her tone light and full of warmth. "It's Cassie." Her playful energy was contagious, and for a moment, Caleb felt the darkness lift slightly. "Cassie," he said softly, relenting. Cassie Ackerman had become his angel, his beacon in the darkness that had slowly consumed his life. She had been there during his lowest moments, offering comfort when he had none left to give himself. Caleb's mind, however, couldn't help but drift back to that terrible day, the day everything changed. He had once been a regular visitor at Brookhaven, arriving like clockwork to check in at the nurse's station before heading to Isabel's room. He'd knock, step inside, and try to coax her into spending time with him. But that day, when he opened the door, his entire world came crashing down. Isabel had been lying there on the bed, her eyes closed, a look of pure ecstasy on her face as she softly moaned. Her smooth tanned body was writhing beneath the pale, bony hands of Stephen Black, who was between her legs, obliviously pleasuring her. The sight froze Caleb in place. His wife, caught in the throes of passion with another man, her body moving rhythmically beneath him. "Yes, Billy," she whispered softly. "Be gentle. You're the only one for me. I love you." The words cut through Caleb like a knife. Isabel's eyes fluttered open, and when she saw him standing in the doorway, her expression turned to one of shock. She screamed, shoving Stephen off her and scrambling to cover herself with the sheets. Stephen, dazed and confused, tumbled from the bed, hitting the floor with a thud. "Who are you?" Isabel shrieked, her voice laced with fear. "Why are you in my room?" Caleb stumbled backward into the hallway, his heart hammering in his chest. His vision blurred, his hands shook uncontrollably, and his breath came in short gasps. He barely made it outside into the garden before he collapsed onto a bench, his emotions overwhelming him. Knowing she had fallen in love with Billy again was one thing, but seeing her with him, watching her give herself to another man, was a pain beyond anything Caleb could have imagined. He had always been the steady one, the rock his family could depend on, no matter the crisis. But now, as he sat alone in that garden, he felt his strength seep away, leaving him hollow and broken, his heart torn open, bleeding out into the empty space where his life once thrived. A good man, a loving husband and father, sat alone on a cold, concrete bench, his body racked with silent sobs. Caleb didn't know how long he had been sitting there, lost in his grief, until he felt the warmth of soft arms wrap around him. He looked up to see Cassie's tear-streaked face as she pulled him closer, holding him while he wept. In that moment, had it not been for Cassie Ackerman's embrace, Caleb feared he might have fallen apart completely. That day had sent ripples far beyond what Caleb could have anticipated. Stephen Black had been swiftly transferred to a facility in the city. Brookhaven, like many other care homes at the time, had lacked clear policies on patient intimacy. But after that incident, everything changed. New guidelines were established, and all patients were now required to wear ankle bracelets with tracking devices. Optical deterrents like yellow lines were added to the floors to prevent wandering. Throughout it all, Cassie had been there for him, standing by his side like an anchor in a storm. He knew then that she was more than just a friend to him. But how much more? Caleb wondered, guilt gnawing at him. Have I allowed the hope of something more to lead me to this decision? His eyes began to water again, as shame crept into his thoughts. What kind of husband am I? He berated himself. I stood before God and vowed to stay with her through sickness and health. How can I just walk away? Caleb? Cassie's gentle voice pulled him out of his downward spiral. He glanced up at her, sorrow etched deep in his eyes. It's our 32nd anniversary, he managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. Cassie nodded, and he could see that she too was holding back her own tears. Tears for him, for his suffering. I know, she said softly. That's why I'm here. It had been weeks since he last saw her at her father's funeral. She had been surrounded by her children and their families, and they hadn't had much time to talk then. But even in the middle of his grief, Caleb had noticed that Brookhaven had felt somehow quieter since her father passed. The man had often sat at his bedroom window, weeping and calling out to the wife who had left him years ago. It had been a haunting and tragic sight, regardless of the man's past. I didn't get a chance to speak with you much at the funeral, Caleb said softly, breaking the silence between them. Cassie gave him a weak smile. It's all right, Caleb. I had my family around me. It was bittersweet. Losing my father was hard, but in many ways, it was also a blessing. Caleb nodded quietly, letting her words sink in. He had heard bits and pieces of Cassie's difficult past, but he knew this wasn't easy for her to admit. My father wasn't a good man, Cassie continued, her voice steady but laced with old pain. I've told you some of it before. He was an alcoholic, abusive. He was so horrible that he drove my mother away. Unfortunately, she left without taking me or my brothers. These last few years, the only thing he remembered was the woman he drove away. He called for her constantly. She paused, letting out a heavy breath. Now, he's finally at rest. But I'm still battling some guilt. I didn't expect to feel relieved when he passed. Caleb reached out and touched her hand gently. Cassie, I understand more than you know. We all face impossible situations, and when they end, relief is a natural response. It doesn't make you a bad person. She gave him a grateful smile, her eyes warm with understanding. That's why I'm here today. Over the past 6 months, we've become good friends. I knew you'd be here today, on your anniversary. Caleb looked down at the small bonsai tree in his hands. He had been holding it tightly, the delicate leaves trembling slightly under his grip. After a few moments, Cassie asked, "Is that an anniversary gift?" "Yes," Caleb murmured. "They say it might be therapeutic for her, something she can care for. I even brought the little tools she'll need." But then his voice wavered and tears welled up in his eyes. "But it's more than that. It's also a farewell gift. I filed for divorce this morning." Cassie placed a comforting hand on his arm. "Oh, Caleb, I'm so sorry." "I know she doesn't realize what she's doing," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I can't sit by and watch her give her love to another man. The only other option would be to stop coming here, but that would feel like abandoning her. And yet, this feels like abandonment too." "What happens now?" she asked gently, sensing the depth of his internal struggle. Caleb's expression hardened as he steeled himself for what lay ahead. "The courts will appoint someone to represent Isabel's best interests. It'll likely be either Alex or Leo. I hope it's Leo. He's had the hardest time accepting my decision. He understands why I'm doing this, but he doesn't fully support it the way Grace and Alex do. Maybe it's because he's not married yet." He sighed deeply. "Leo's always been protective of his mother. I won't deny Isabel anything. Her care will be our top priority no matter what." Caleb grew quiet, staring down at the wedding ring on his finger. He absently twisted it over and over, his voice barely a whisper when he spoke again. "After the divorce is finalized, I'll apply for an annulment." Cassie could see the shame he was wrestling with, and her heart ached for him. "I feel like such a hypocrite," he continued. "How can anyone pretend that a 32-year marriage never existed?" "I wish I could take away the pain," she said softly, her voice thick with empathy. Caleb offered a weak smile, grateful for her presence, but still heavy with the weight of his choices. "You being here helps me more than you realize, Cassandra," Caleb said, his voice soft but sincere. She raised an eyebrow at him, and Caleb let out a small, sad chuckle. "Cassie," he corrected himself gently, the hint of a smile returning to his lips. His words drew a smile from her in return, a warm and lively expression that seemed to brighten her entire demeanor. Her eyes sparkled, and the quiet, consoling presence she had held moments before now shifted into something more vibrant, full of life. "Have I ever told you what brought me to Brownwood?" she asked, her tone light and playful, as though trying to ease his mind from its heavy thoughts. Caleb smiled, recognizing the distraction for what it was, and grateful for it. "You've shared bits and pieces," he said, leaning back a little, "but I'd be honored to hear the rest." Cassie chuckled softly and gave him a playful wink. "Well, since you already know most of it, I'll keep it short." Caleb nodded, listening closely as she began. "Like Isabel, I fell in love when I was 18, Cassie started. But while she gave her heart to a good man, I ended up falling for the local bad boy. He got me pregnant, and although he married me, 4 years later, he ran off with his secretary, left me broke and alone with 2 small kids." She paused for a moment, a trace of the old pain crossing her face before she continued. "That's what brought me to Brownwood. I got a job at the battery plant and met my second husband, Henry Ackerman. We were married for 15 years before he died of cancer. Since then, I've been looking for someone special to spend the rest of my life with, though I haven't quite found him yet." Caleb couldn't help but grin. After years of dealing with evasive clients and unreliable contractors, he found Cassie's directness refreshing. She was a woman who knew what she wanted and had no trouble pursuing it with determination. "I knew Henry," Caleb said with a soft smile. "He was a good man. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," Cassie replied, her smile gentle. "He was a good man, and now that he's gone, I know he'd want me to keep living my life." She turned toward Caleb, her eyes filled with compassion. "Caleb, from what you've told me, I have to believe the old Isabel would want the same for you." Her words echoed the plea his daughter Grace had made to him months earlier. "Papa, please," she had begged, "stop doing this to yourself. Watching her with him day after day is killing you. Mama would understand. Please, Papa." He had felt the sting of Grace's words then, though he knew she spoke out of love. The truth was, Isabel would have understood. Years ago, she had made him promise to continue living his life when the time came, even if that meant moving on without her. His mind wanted to honor that promise, but his heart hadn't caught up yet. "She does," Caleb murmured, his eyes drifting back to Cassie beside him. "At least she did. She made me promise to keep living after she was gone, mentally at least." "And?" Cassie prodded gently. Caleb sighed, his gaze dropping to the ground as he struggled to find the right words. "I'm finding it hard to keep that promise. I know she's not in her right mind anymore, and that helps soften the pain a little. But watching someone you've loved your whole life give their love to another, there's no way to describe that. It's almost unbearable." Cassie placed a hand on his, her touch light but full of comfort. "I'm so sorry you've had to endure this," she said softly. "But Caleb, you will get through this, and one day, you'll love again. I know that from experience." Caleb looked at her, his gratitude for her kindness welling up inside him. "Cassie, I need to thank you," he said, his voice growing thick with emotion. "You've been a godsend to me, someone I can lean on. I need you to know how much that means to me. But I also have to confess, my feelings for you aren't completely honorable." For a moment, Cassie's eyes widened in surprise before her face broke into a wide smile. She chuckled softly, her laughter warm and genuine. "Caleb," she said teasingly, "I would have been offended if they had been completely honorable." Caleb stared at her, unsure whether to laugh or remain silent. But Cassie cleared her throat and met his gaze with a serious, steady look. "I think of you as a good and honorable man," she said, her tone soft but sincere. "You're someone I'd like to get to know better, not just as a friend. My second husband was a good man too, but he wasn't exactly a proper gentleman. You, Caleb Rivera, are the epitome of a true gentleman, and I'd be lying if I said that didn't intrigue me." Her words left Caleb momentarily speechless. Cassie had a way of making him feel seen, understood, and appreciated. And though he hadn't planned for any of this, hadn't expected it, the thought of exploring whatever lay between them no longer seemed impossible. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something new, something unexpected, and perhaps something healing. Her smile lit up her face, making her eyes glimmer with a mix of warmth and challenge, daring him to look away. It was as if she held him captive in that moment, and Caleb couldn't help but feel the intensity of her gaze. "Caleb," Cassie began softly, "I'm only saying this because you've taken a huge step toward moving on with your life. I know I haven't hidden my feelings for you, but I would have never encouraged you until you were ready to move on. Cassie, Caleb said, his voice low and honest, I won't lie. Spending more time with you has been on my mind. It may have influenced my decision in some way. She quickly shook her head, her expression tightening in concern. Oh no, Caleb. Please don't think that. Seeing the pain in her eyes, he instinctively reached for her hand, which she took in both of hers. She sighed deeply, and when she met his gaze again, her eyes were full of understanding. Caleb, she began, you're a very attractive man. I'm sure you've had women show interest in you over the years. Are you saying you never found any of them attractive? He hesitated, then responded, No, it's not that. There were women I found attractive, but I never acted on those feelings. Exactly, she replied, her voice calm. And you haven't with me either. There's a reason we haven't spoken in weeks. I knew you were getting close to making some difficult decisions, and I wanted to be sure I wasn't influencing them. She paused, watching him carefully before continuing. What you're feeling now is the reassurance that someone still finds you desirable. That's natural. It's something that helps people get through the fear of starting over. If it hadn't been me, it would have been someone else who made you realize you're still attractive to others. Cassie shifted closer, her voice soothing yet firm. Tell me, Caleb, before you filed those divorce papers this morning, did you plan to call me and ask me out tonight? Caleb shook his head, his expression somber. No. All I could think about was my marriage. And that's exactly where your focus should have been, Cassie said. It was a huge step, and it needed your full attention. What about tomorrow or later this week? Had you planned to reach out to me? He hesitated again, then said quietly, No, it was too soon. She nodded knowingly. And even if you had wanted to call me, how would you have done it? I've never given you my number. Caleb paused, then smiled faintly as he remembered. You own the Cassie Cat Diner by the battery plant. I guess I would have tried calling you there. Cassie smiled warmly, her eyes soft. You're a smart man, Caleb. But even if you had called the diner, you would have only reached one of my employees. I never gave you my personal number because it wasn't appropriate. I've been careful not to do anything that could harm what we have, even if it stayed just a friendship. Her voice softened as she held his hand tighter. Over the coming months, Caleb, you might feel guilty about moving on. But I want to make something clear. If you think that I had anything to do with your decision to end your marriage, it could ruin any chance of something between us. That's why I've kept my distance. She leaned in closer, her hands cupping his face with tender care. She turned his head gently, forcing him to meet her gaze once more. Her fingers brushed lightly across his cheek, and the sincerity in her eyes spoke louder than words. Caleb, there is life after this, she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. It may not feel like it now, but there will be joy and love again. Whether that life includes me or not, well, that's something we'll have to figure out together, if it comes to that. She let her words settle between them for a moment before continuing. But for now, you need to grieve. You need time to process everything. I won't reach out to you again until you feel ready to talk. If you want to call me as a friend, I'll be here. Anything beyond that, well, that'll be up to you. I'll wait for you for a time, Caleb, because I believe you're the kind of man worth waiting for. Her final words hung in the air, filled with a quiet strength that Caleb admired. She wasn't pushing him. She was giving him the space he needed, offering him the chance to heal without pressure or expectation. And for that, he felt something deeper than gratitude. He felt hope. Caleb sat in silence for a few moments, absorbing the weight of their conversation. Then, a small smile tugged at the corners of his lips. What number should I call? Cassie's face lit up with laughter. She reached into her purse, pulling out a small makeup bag. After a moment of deliberation, she selected a tube of lipstick. Every time she glanced at Caleb, her smile widened, making it hard for her to apply the lipstick with a steady hand. Finally, satisfied with the result, she pulled out a pen and a small piece of paper, writing down her number. With a playful glint in her eyes, she pressed the paper to her lips, leaving a bright kiss mark behind. She handed it to him with a smile that was both sweet and mischievous. Call me, she said softly, adding a wink for good measure. Caleb took the note, a sense of warmth and renewal blooming in his chest. He realized then that there could indeed be light after the darkness. Nurse Claire Walsh walked down the dimly lit corridor, her footsteps quiet on the polished floor, as she checked on each patient. The night shift always brought challenges. What began as calm could quickly spiral into chaos when a patient awoke disoriented, unsure of where they were. Adding to the difficulty was her unofficial role as a chaperone, monitoring wandering patients. Most of the time innocent, though on rare occasions, not so much. Daniel and Isabel were the pair that kept her busiest. Their little escapades had become almost a game, like two mischievous children sneaking around. The anklets each patient now wore had helped curb their wanderings, much to their mutual dismay. As Claire approached Isabel's room, she heard the soft sound of crying. Her heart sank, and she hurried inside. Isabel sat on her bed, her body trembling as she stared at a small bonsai tree. Tears streamed down her face, tracing paths of sorrow down her once beautiful features. Claire moved to sit beside her, wrapping a gentle arm around Isabel's shoulders. "Isabel, what's wrong?" she whispered softly. I don't know," Isabel sobbed, her voice broken. "When I look at this tree, it just makes me so sad." Claire glanced at the small tree and immediately understood. All the staff knew the sad story behind it. For the past 2 months, Isabel had been meticulously caring for the bonsai, and despite everything, it had begun to flourish. "Would you like me to take it away, honey?" Claire asked softly, offering a comforting smile. Isabel's response was immediate. "No," she cried out, then softened. "No, I think it was a gift, but not from Billy." Claire tilted her head, concern etching her features. "Do you know who gave it to you then?" she asked gently. Isabel shook her head, burying her face in her hands. "I don't know, but I feel like I should. There's a card, but it's unsigned," she whispered through her tears, her confusion and sorrow mingling. Claire carefully reached for the card beside the bonsai. She knew its contents, but she read it again in silence. "My love, I'm giving you the only gift I have left to give you. Your freedom. Goodbye, my darling." Claire felt her chest tighten as she placed the card back down. She gently pulled Isabel into her arms, holding her as the confused woman wept. Isabel's sobs gradually slowed, exhaustion overtaking her as she cried herself into silence. Claire tucked her in carefully, smoothing the blankets over her. "Do you want me to leave the door cracked open?" Claire asked in a soft whisper. Isabel nodded, her face pale and drained. "Yes, please," she murmured. Claire gave her one last comforting glance before heading back to her station. The hallway fell silent again as Isabel curled into her pillow, staring at the faint silhouette of the bonsai tree. The shadows in the room concealed the tears that once more began to fall from her eyes. And as the darkness enclosed her, only the still night heard her quiet, desperate whispers. "My love, where are you? Please, don't leave me."